And I wrote this particular hymn entitled The Garden of Gethsemane because that's where this location was many years ago, because I got to reading and I got to thinking, well, no one's ever written that I know of had written a song about that. And so I put a couple of pieces of music together and wrote the lyrics, and that's what this is about that night that Christ spent in Gethsemane. In the Garden of Gethsemane, a young man knelt to pray for the strength he knew that he would need to face his death next day. 'Cause he knew what he must do none other had before, that the greatest test of all mankind was right outside the door. Right outside the door. And he knew he mustn't fail. And he knew he couldn't quit. And he'd have to face the Romans with their scorpions and whips. Scorpions and whips. As the young man knelt to pray, you could see his face was strained. His eyes were filled with visions of death and fear and pain. And he knew what he'd endure that others might see light. Through his death, all mankind would have happiness and light. Happiness and life. And he knew he mustn't fail. And he knew he couldn't quit. And he'd have to face the Romans with their scorpions and whips. Scorpions and whips. Well, the young man was desperate and his face fell to the ground. As he arose and looked around him, no friends were seen or found. And he knew what he would face, he'd have to face alone. Only one man would be faithful, only one man would be strong. Only one man would be strong. And he knew he mustn't fail. And he knew he couldn't quit. And he'd have to face the Romans with their scorpions and whips. Scorpions and whips. Well, his rough face was filled with tears and his strong hands lifted high. 3 times he'd beg his father that death might pass him by. But he knew it could not be, he must live his father's will. In the end he knew he'd suffer, in the end he would be killed. In the end he would be killed. And he knew he mustn't fail. And he knew he couldn't quit. And he'd have to face the Romans with their scorpions and whips. Yeah, scorpions and whips. Well, the young man was in anguish. He prayed more earnestly. His sorrow grew heavier as he knelt on his knees. And as he prayed, sweat mixed with blood flowed freely down his brow. And he knew he must keep keep praying to get the strength somehow. Yeah, to get the strength somehow. And he knew he mustn't fail, and he knew he couldn't quit, and he'd have to face the Romans with their scorpions and whips. Yeah, scorpions and whips. Then slowly his face began to change. No longer would he cry, no longer would he pray that death might pass him by. For the strength he knew he would need, his Father freely gave, and his heart was filled with visions and his courage that all men he could save. All men he could save. And he knew he mustn't fail, and he knew he couldn't quit, and he'd have to face the Romans with their scorpions and whips. Yeah, scorpions and whips. And now that moving story has been etched in history, about a man who prayed for strength to die for you and me. And we know he's still praying right at the Father's throne. And he prays that you'd be faithful, and he prays that you'd be strong. Yeah, he prays that you'd be strong. In the Garden of Gethsemane, well, a young man knelt to pray.